Well, I mean, I feel like I've always kind of been drawn to kind of darker humor and storylines and that sort of thing. And, kind of things that don't have like happy Hollywood endings and that sort of thing. So I kind of have always been drawn to that. But I think the one movie that really stands out that really drew me into horror specifically, I think, is the original Night of the Living Dead. Um, I remember borrowing a VHS copy from the library when I was probably 11 or 12 years old. And my parents probably didn't realize what I was getting, but I threw it in my stack of books and just kind of popped it into the VCR at home and just was just blown away by this black and white movie that appeared so old to me. This was in the mid 80s when I was watching it. And so the movie was less than 20 years old, but it seemed so ancient to me because it was in black and white. And it just struck me how uh, not only was it ahead of its time in terms of like the gore and the violence and stuff, but also just the fact that it had this black guy starring as the leader of this group of people. And he was kind of taking charge and slapping white people around and stuff like that. And I thought, wow, this is, I mean, amazing. Like, because even when I watched it in the 80s, I think that kind of a role would have still been ahead of its time then, because we still really didn't see that many movies, especially in horror, with this black character being the central protagonist and the person you're rooting for. So that really, I think, got me into horror in general, but also into the black role within horror and how it's portrayed typically.
What was it like growing up as a horror fan, but also as a person of color? And obviously, your book delves into it a bit, kind of the stereotypes that Black characters often faced in horror films. But just as a fan growing up, what was it like while also being a person of color?
It was an interesting experience. Just because as the title of the book goes, the black guy always dies first, or he doesn't always, but typically he doesn't fare well. At least in those days when I was watching movies, you know, regardless of the genre, I remember black characters were so rare on TV and in films that, like, I remember as a child, if a black character was on TV in any capacity, any role, I would kind of go running through the house like, "There's a black person on TV. There's a black person on TV," because it was just we were just so starved for that sort of representation. So I really paid attention to those things, and in horror, it was black characters typically didn't fare well, but as I said, I was still drawn to the genre because I love the darkness of the storytelling and the just the scares and the gore and all that kind of stuff. So it was an interesting experience. I continued to love the genre even though black characters didn't fare well, and I kind of took it with a grain of salt because really it wasn't only in horror that black characters were sidelined and marginalized. It was in every genre. Like the black character would always be the buddy cop who was who died, and the main guy would have to avenge his death and all that sort of thing. So um it was definitely something that spread through different genres, but it didn't really dampen my love for horror, and I kind of used it to kind of fuel my website that I created in 2005 or so. Even though I knew that the representations of black people in horror weren't that prominent or that great in general up to that time, it still was kind of important to show that fact through my website. I thought it was good to still document the fact that these characters do tend to fall into these roles, these marginalized roles, and that itself is something to kind of noteworthy to kind of keep track of and to kind of document. And it eventually culminated in the book, which is really my dream project, really. We talk about in the book a little bit. There's a couple of different dynamics historically speaking. On one hand, you have the horror genre in general kind of becoming more violent over the years, like in the 1960s, and so especially it kind of started to ramp up in terms of, I think the public was kind of a little more jaded maybe and kind of was demanding a little more violence. So I think horror movies tended to kind of amp up the violence starting in the 1960s or so. And then around the same time, black roles, the typical black roles of like kind of the Mantan Moreland type of buffoonish comedic characters, they kind of became passe and or kind of written out of these movies, and so there wasn't really much of a role for black characters. So I think Hollywood at some point decided, they realized with the rise of the blaxploitation era that there was a demand for black characters and there was an audience for black characters. So there was kind of, on one hand, horror was becoming more violent, and on the other hand, Hollywood was trying to find roles for black characters, and I think they kind of combined starting in the 1970s, but I think it really took off more in the 1980s with the slasher boom. That Hollywood was like, oh, okay, we got to have these violent movies, we got to have victims, and we got to find roles for these black characters, but we don't want to have them as the heroes. We don't necessarily want to put them in the main roles. So the perfect role for them would be to have them being just kind of these people to throw in for a body count. So we'll throw the black guy in there along with the nerd or the cheerleader or whatever type that they had in the these slasher movies that were kind of the secondary roles. The black guy was kind of just thrown in there as somebody to kind of bump up the gore and the violence. And so I think that's kind of where it really took hold, especially when slasher movies become really popular in the 1980s. I think it kind of demanded a body count. You had to have like 6 or 8 or 10 kills every movie. So I think that's really where the whole black guy dying first kind of came to fruition.
What would you say are kind of milestones, kind of those really important moments in horror history?
There are definitely a few movies that really stand out, like Blackula in the 1970s was really, I think, important, not only for black horror, but blaxploitation in general, as one of the early blaxploitation movies, and its popularity really kind of greenlit a few other black horror movies like Dr. Black, Mr. Hyde, and Blackenstein and Ganja and Hess. I think those came directly from the success of Blackula. Then I think, really though, it's kind of gone in cycles. So black horror, along with black cinema, has kind of gone in cycles. We had the blaxploitation era in the 70s, and then once that kind of died down, Hollywood kind of wiped their hands of black characters for a while in the 80s because they thought, oh, that blaxploitation era is done. We've done our part. We've kind of wrung that market dry. And I think in the 80s things kind of dried up. And then back in the 90s, we had you had like Spike Lee kind of kicked off the another black film cycle. And so then we had important movies in the horror like Tales from the Hood, Death by Temptation, Demon Knight. Those are 3 that come to mind from the 1990s that really kind of kept black horror in the limelight. Then really, I think it's kind of that cycle kind of died down again around the turn of the century, and I think again, like Hollywood was kind of like, we've done the black movie thing again, and it petered out. So I think it really has only in the last 5 or 10 years really started to come back in terms of black film in general, but also black horror. And Jordan Peele's movies really are the ones that stand out in terms of, especially Get Out. I think that really kind of opened the floodgates for Hollywood to think, oh, we can do something with this black horror thing. I think it's kind of a double-edged sword because it's great because it's really opened doors for a lot of more movies, but I think on the other hand, everything is going to be compared to Get Out at some point if it's a black horror movie. And so I think sometimes we try, either the filmmakers or the studios try a little too hard to emulate Get Out and try to make it the next Get Out, when we could really broaden the scope of these stories and kind of venture out and get different perspectives from different filmmakers. So there's been a lot more inclusiveness in horror in general, even beyond black racial things. I mean, it's more like gender and sexuality and all kinds of, just a lot more openness right now, I think, in the genre than there ever has been. But yeah, I think I've lived through the worst of the times, in the 80s, and so when you are starved for any black character in horror. So I definitely have seen how bad it has been. And so, yeah, it's definitely been really improved in the last few years. I mean, just this year we had major movies like The Blackening. We had Talk to Me, starred a black female character. Even like The Last Voyage of the Demeter, which is a Dracula movie you wouldn't think would have a black character in it, but the main hero in that is a black guy who's on the ship. And so I think Hollywood is doing a good job of kind of finding ways to put these different perspectives, black characters into these roles that you wouldn't necessarily think of them being in.
When it comes to recommending horror films, whether they be black horror or not, what is always kind of your go-to recommendation?
I mean, the one that sticks out that I've recommended recently over the past few years is a movie from Great Britain called His House. It's a haunted house movie it's about these African immigrants who are refugees from Africa who come to England, and they're put in this public housing, and the house happens to be haunted, and they're kind of stuck there because they have only a limited amount of say in where they can live. So they kind of have to deal with what the haunting and what it kind of represents, and it kind of ties back to their past in Africa and the trauma that they experienced. But I recommend it highly to a lot of people because it's very accessible. I think it's accessible to horror fans because it's actually genuinely scary. It's really well done as far as horror goes, but it's also accessible to people who aren't really into horror because it's got a really great acting, really great drama. It's got a really great, interesting story, dramatic core to it. This relationship between these husband and wife, and how they have dealt with their past traumas in different ways, and how it comes back to literally haunt them. And so, I think it's really accessible, and it's something I thought that if horror got more respect on the awards scale, I thought it really could have been nominated for an Oscar in a couple of years ago when it came out. But it's available on Netflix, I think. So I definitely recommend everybody check it out.